Screen. Now, full screen. Myself, Hirva Pandya, and today I am going to deal with fantasy literature. This is my personal information. Points to ponder. What is fantasy literature? Fantasy literature in 20th century. Characteristics of fantasy literature. Five essential elements every fantasy novel need. Conclusion and citation. Definition of fantasy literature. Fantasy is meaning of fantasy literature is it is imaginative fiction depended for effect on strangeness of setting and of characters as a supernatural or unnatural beings in which the plot could not happen in real life. Often the plot involves magic or witchcraft and takes place on another planet or in another undiscovered dimension of this world. Fantasy literature of 20th century. Here I highlighted main points of fantasy literature of 20th century. In 20th century, after 1937, it started with J.R.R. Tolkien, and it is considered as golden age of fantasy genre. Occurred during the 1950s and 1960s, with Tolkien's addition along are considered more as C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia and Ursula K. Le Guin's Arthur C. These titles help forge clear identity for fantasy genre and airy epics. During this time period, fantasy became more sophisticated and mostly affected by the developments of science and technology, such as quantum physics, new theories regarding origin of the universe, and experiments with atomic energy. In the 20th century fantasy literature, there is supernatural proceeding, time shifts, and other worlds. In 1977, the fantasy novel finally hit the bestseller list with Terry Brooks' Sword of Shannara, Young Adult Sword and Sorcery. Books such as those by Robert Jordan and David Eddings became very popular, and more recently, authors such as Diana Winner Jones, Tomra Pierce, and J.K. Rowling are keeping the fantasy genre well. Characteristics of fantasy genre: good versus evil. This is the most primary factor of fantasy genre. The protagonist has both sides. One is a good and other side is evil side. We can take example of the novel Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The person is only one in the novel, but he has both sides like good and evil. The fantasy novel often set in a medieval universe or a laboratory, from Middle Earth to Narnia, Alexia, Hogwarts, and even Fox, the setting another character in the story. It is the unique quality of landscapes that allows for the of the events in the story take place. Man versus society. In the fantasy novel, there is always a person is alone and society is against him. Example: Frankenstein uh, in this genre, monster is alone in the world story, and society is against him. Five essential need elements every fantasy novel need. First is magic system. A magic system refers to things occurs or exist in your story that do not or cannot exist in the supernatural, advanced abilities or power. Basically anything with no basis real world evidence or logic can be considered as magic. A well developing setting. This is another absolutely vital animal within fantasy fiction. When you are writing this genre, your story take place or author story take place completely in a new world. In order to immerse readers in your world, you must develop your setting thoroughly and thoughtfully, a cast of complex character. As with any novel, is often characters in fantasy fiction that truly get readers invested in the story. Your setting, plot, and magic system may intrigue you and engage readers, but none of these aspects matter if your readers don't care about the characters and their outcomes. Central conflict. This is the central key of every good fantasy novel or every good fantasy story. This is especially true in a fantasy fiction where the stakes are often higher. Your characters and story usually stretches across multiple books in a series. The Harry Potter series is the great example of conflict in fantasy fiction. While each book contains its own internal conflict, the series as a whole deals with one central conflict, that between the boy wizard and Harry, the evil Lord Voldemort. This conflict ties all seven volumes of the series together and keeps the story moving forward at all the times. Conclusion. As Pamela S. Gates stated, literary fantasy became a medium of sustain our need for heroes and perpetual belief that good can overcome evil, but without the level of moralizing found in earlier texts. This is my point of view. To sum up this, it is very rightly said by writer. This is not by the writer. I mistaken because the fantasy add more capacity to build a beautiful and imaginative world. These are my citation. Thank you.
So, Hirva, my question is, as you said in your PPT that in fantasy literature, person always remain alone and society become against him. And you gave the example of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, for what reason Dr. Jekyll, the society become against the Dr. Jekyll? Do you know it?
Dr. Jekyll has both sides. Society only knows the good side of Mr. Jekyll, but when the society comes to know about the evil side, they left the Dr. Jekyll alone, and they are against society against Dr. Jekyll.
But he is not alone from the beginning. We can say that.
Yes, yes, he is not alone from the beginning, because he from beginning he only shown the society the good side, not evil side. Evil side is evil side is evil side. We can know about that evil side in the last part or last sequence of this novel.
Yes, Hirba, my question is why people are more interesting in 20th century to see fantasy movies rather than books.
Fantasy movie are above beyond our capacity, and people or a person is always tries to live in a fantasy world, and he likes the more fantasy world than the logic and reasoning world.